Everybody. My name's Chris Ford, and I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to what I think will be an absolutely fascinating discussion. We had an enormous number of RSVPs for this, quite a good number. I see the weather is delaying people's arrival slightly, so I ask ask you to all show patience with those who may be pushing by you on their way into seats in the next few minutes, if that happens. But welcome. We're glad to have you all here. Readers of newspapers in the United States and elsewhere, or at least in countries where one is permitted to have free access to information, could be forgiven for thinking that issues of Western Pacific naval strategy largely boil down to a sort of technological, doctrinal determinism, if you will. We've seen lots of press coverage speculating about the impact upon the regional military balance, for instance, and upon strategic stability. Of new Chinese capabilities, for instance, such as ballistic missiles designed to hit ships at sea, low observable aircraft, new submarines, space, anti-space, and cyber capabilities, and even now an operational aircraft carrier. Now, there's been also, on the other side of this discussion, there's been no shortage of discussion and speculation and argument, frankly, about the ability of U.S. forces, if it came to it, through operational concepts such as the air-sea battle doctrine, to fight their way back into the region if need be in support of threatened allies in facing off against these capabilities. But what we wanted to do is open the focus of the lens a little bit. In conceptual terms, these accounts that you sort of see so much of in the press seem to presuppose that the basic question here is a two-player game. And as much as we might like to flatter ourselves, it isn't all just about us. And so what we're hoping to do is to focus Washington's intellectual juices a little bit, as it were, on the other players and how they fit into this picture as well. There are, of course, other players in the region. Democratic polities in particular, but not exclusively, but democratic polities who are our friends and allies in many cases, who have open political and economic systems and are, in a sense, rather more invested in these questions even than we are. And so we wanted to broaden the focus a bit to get a bit of a focus of attention on how America's friends and allies fit into these questions. Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and perhaps others, how they fit in not only in the event of potential conflict, but particularly with regard to preventing and deterring war and securing the peace through better cooperation ahead of time. What is being done, for example, on allied and friendly cooperation amongst the, sadly, growing number of states in the region that feel growing security threats. What challenges do we face in this regard? And critically, what more can be done in the realm of naval strategy, planning, defense, trade, political military cooperation, diplomacy, and other areas in order to improve regional security and to protect the open, liberal political order in the region and economic order in the region that has meant so much and brought such prosperity to all the countries of the Pacific Rim for so long. So clearly there is a very great deal to discuss, which is why I'm delighted that we have such a great panel of discussants here today. Now, unfortunately, Jerry Roncolato emailed us this morning that he is very sick this morning and has to, suffering from the winter flu or something. So we wish him a very speedy and complete recovery, and we're sorry he couldn't join us. But we do have a couple of excellent panelists here with us, as you can all see from the program. Immediately to my left here is Paul Chiara. He served as a naval aviator as well as a naval strategic planner and a political military strategic planner for Far East, South Asia, and Pacific issues. During his Navy career, he also managed the U.S.-Japan alliance for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's the president of Global Strategies and Transformation, which is a professional services firm and strategic planning consultancy in the defense and national security realm. And he specializes in Japan, China, East Asia, and NATO futures and military transformation issues. Very apropos. He's also a Harvard man, I'll give a call out to that, as well as a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, and he attended the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. Brian Macrath, to his left, is also a retired naval officer who commanded the destroyer USS Bulkley and subsequently led the team that wrote the United States' current maritime strategy in 2007. More recently, he is the founder of Delex Consulting Studies and Analysis, a consultancy that specializes in defense and national security issues. He's got degrees from the University of Virginia and the Catholic University of America here in town, as well as the U.S. Naval War College. Brian did not get the memo that one is supposed to wear a bow tie. I'm sorry to say. But despite that, we have a terrific panel. I'm sure you'll agree. We're delighted that they can be here. and I'm sure you join me in looking forward very much to what they have to say. We will open the floor after their remarks to questions and answers. There is a mic running around, I believe, which we ask you to refrain from starting your question until you have the mic so that we can, the rest of us can hear this, and also so that this can be put onto, we're actually live streaming to the internet, so watch your language. But ask your questions into the microphone so that we can make sure that it gets clearly to all of the people who watch these things, either in the current moment and also on cached video thereafter. So without any further ado, I thank you for coming, and I don't know if you gentlemen care whether you come up here or not. Feel free to give your remarks from your seat if you prefer. It's entirely your discretion. But I will turn the floor over to you, Paul, and thank you all for coming.
Well, Chris is right. I was in the Navy, and everybody always, most of the time, understood why I was getting my flight pay. They weren't always sure why I was getting my base pay, but I survived all that. And in the second half of my naval career, I became a designated strategic planner. And I can address the topic today, which I want to take from the perspective of strategy, because I've made all the mistakes possible and some that are unprecedented in thinking about strategy. I think that when one thinks about this region, that region there, and when one thinks about nations in it, not just China, but the other nations associated with and subject to China's militarized emergence, one has to think strategically. And you don't have to get too complicated to think about that. After all, this is not unprecedented. You can go back to 200 years ago and you get 6 or 7 examples of great emerging power versus status quo power rivalries. And they don't turn out well. And so that ought to be enough to focus our imagination, but it's interesting that it hasn't yet. And sort of the basis of my remarks is that we haven't confronted this issue very well. We certainly haven't done so creatively. And as a result, Beijing is completely unimpressed with anything we're doing, pretty much across the board, and certainly not deterred from what Beijing is doing. So it seems to me that we need to change that equation, because I think we're in a very, very difficult, taxing, threatening, perhaps civilizational competition with China. I hope it turns out well, but I think, and I'm kind of a simple-minded guy. I kind of came up through the Cold War. I served in the Navy through the second half of the Cold War. And while I was in the Navy working on maritime strategy as one of Brian's predecessors, although we're the same age, our job was to try to shepherd the Navy into the post-Cold War world. I'm not sure how well we did, because, as an example, I gave the briefing on the Navy staff that told the Navy that it was okay to de-emphasize anti-submarine warfare. This was in 1991, early 1991. And I don't know about you, but I rue the day that that happened, and I certainly wish I hadn't given that briefing. Because what happened subsequent to that was that the Navy became unbalanced. And the Navy stopped thinking about defense and could only think about offense. And that's all well and good, as long as everybody cooperates with that. But the Chinese essentially have told us they're no longer going to cooperate with that, and that the Chinese are going to make us play defense. So what does that mean? These are some of the facts that have to be taken into account. As a result, we're going to, if we continue to have designs on forward presence in the Western Pacific, we're going to have to remember how we used to think about fighting to pass through our own lines, how to fight to stay forward, and how to fight to get forward, and then how to fight to stay forward. That's before we fight. So these are very different strategic circumstances than have ensued since the end of the Cold War. but they should be very, very familiar to those who know anything about the Cold War, because those were the circumstances that pertained then. So Chris has asked Brian and me to cover this subject, and Brian and I haven't talked too much about this, but I'm going to pretty much come at it in a high level, and Brian's going to talk a little bit more about military operational and military technical things as I understand what he said. I may have misconstrued that, and I apologize in advance if that's so. So it seems to me that we have to do exactly what Herman Kahn, who is so intimately associated with the Hudson Institute, prescribed, which is figure out what the problem is. The first order of business is, what's the question? Andrew Marshall addressed this with Albert Wohlstetter in their book on not confusing ourselves, and other great strategic thinkers have sort of made the same point. Albert Einstein said if you had 60 minutes to save the world, you should spend the first 59 minutes figuring out what the problem is. And I think that's true. There's absolutely no question in my mind that the United States, perhaps hobbled now and in the future, and at least in the near future, by real budgetary problems, is going to be able to do maybe not as much or as vigorously as it has in the past, solving issues technically and doctrinally and so on. But it's definitely not going to be able to do that if there's not a common conception of what the problem is. So it seems to me, and this is sort of where I, at least when I'm allowed, this is where I like to operate. Now this is different than the more routine definition of strategy, which is the ends, ways, means sort of equation. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what it is that we're trying to solve in the first place. I think there are many who are perfectly capable of working on the ends, ways, and means equation, and more power to them. I don't like that kind of work. Well, I like to think about where we are. So where is the United States? I think the United States is right there. This is an illustration from a book chapter that appears in Tom Menken's book on competitive strategies. This is my book chapter, and that's my illustration. And that shows China coming to sea. China has to come to sea because China has perceived that it is its strategy to keep the United States away from the maritime approaches to China. China also has to come to sea in order to dominate the Asia-Pacific littoral, as well as to protect her own sea lines of communication upon which, at least for the time being, and probably for the foreseeable future, she depends intrinsically. So China had a choice. China also gets a strategic choice, and China could have done so peacefully. China could have simply said, we're emerging, we're getting bigger, there are going to be more Chinese merchantmen on the high seas. So just get used to the idea. And we, frankly, probably we would have. We would have accepted that, and that would be fine. However, China seems, in my opinion, some of you won't agree, China has said, no, we're going to make a fight of this. Because what has China done? China has militarized her emergence. So now we're confronted with, in many ways, the same situation that faced Great Britain in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I'm reminded of the discussion with the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, Lord St. Vincent, in 1801, when he was asked about the most salient military problem facing Great Britain at the time, which is the potential invasion of England by France. Now, at the time, just to remind, and this should resonate with the naval officers in the audience, especially the British ones, at the time, the Royal Navy was Great Britain's largest employer. It was the most innovative organization in England. It was inventing all kinds of things. It had to figure out how to keep crews at sea for very long times without them dying. Without them dying of things like scurvy. It had to be very innovative. And these crews were at sea for not weeks, not months, but years at a time. St. Vincent, when he said what I'm about to quote, had been at sea for years. Nelson, with the exception of a few weeks ashore just prior to the Battle of Trafalgar, had been at sea for 3 years. At sea, on the ship. So when asked, St. Vincent said about the potential for an invasion of England, St. Vincent said, I'm not saying that the Frenchman won't come. I'm saying that he won't come by sea. Because the Royal Navy had figured out, and England had figured out, what the problem was. That strategically, if England could keep Napoleon on the continent, if England could defeat Napoleon's extracontinental adventures, that's why the Battle of the Nile was so important and so on, then things might, and hopefully would, sort of sort themselves out on the continent. And that's exactly what the Royal Navy did. And this was achieved before the Battle of Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar was simply the bow on the box that made it quite clear, dramatically clear. But St. Vincent, by the turn of the century, had achieved this end as the first Sea Lord. So, it would seem to me that the question is, what do we do about not China's emergence as a great power, not China's emergence as an economic engine, to the extent that that's true, but rather what we should do about China's militarized emergence. Now, even under normal circumstances, and I consider America's budgetary problems of today to be not normal, in order to confront an emerging power like China, just as we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we need allies. On the best of days, we need allies, and then on the worst of days, we really need allies. Now, Churchill said the only thing worse than working with allies is working without them, and he's right. He was right about that. Alliance management is a pain in the neck. It's a pain in the neck for the allies, too, especially when you have an ally like the United States that is often overbearing, indifferent, distracted, insular, and disconnected from those allies. Now, you may think that that's a contradiction because, after all, we have great alliances with great allies. Well, the reality is that that's seldom the case, and it's never is what it appears to be. But in any case, now we need allies. Why do we need allies? Well, if you look at that map, you will see sort of an operational space, what I call the future battle space, that triangle that stretches from Sakhalin to Singapore to Guam. That's where this collision, that's where this competition is going to play out. It's going to play out in that offshore space because what we're talking about is a contest for control of the maritime approaches to China. Now, if you think about it, recent news is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily about the southern end of that battle space, the South China Sea. And that's important. Some of the news is about the northern end and the Senkakus in the East China Sea. But the fact of the matter is that what you have here fundamentally, in a strategic sense, is a country that is trying to control and dominate the interior lines, China, and a country that has the advantage, and I say that advisedly, of the exterior lines. That's the United States and our allies. Now, a country that has use of the exterior lines will typically not prevail if it concentrates its efforts only at one point. Why is that? Because then that gives the advantage to the country that has the interior lines. That country can concentrate its defensive efforts and defeat the opponent on the exterior lines. This is what happened, for instance, at the Battle of Antietam. McClellan allowed the Confederates to attack him ad seriatim at different points rather than attacking the outnumbered Confederates all along. So it became, as a result, the bloodiest day in American military history. You don't want to repeat that. So what does this mean for the United States and our allies? It means that what we probably are facing is a requirement to challenge China along the periphery, the entire periphery of that battle space. That means that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, at least potentially, can be very, very important on the northern end, on the northern flank of that battle space. It seems to me that, with regard to alliance management, that is the proposition. The rest is details. Difficult as they may be, fractious as they may be, almost interminably complex, because these are very difficult allies, and alliance management, even with collegial allies, is very, very hard. It's just hard work. So let's consider the three allies for a minute and what their sort of strategic political circumstances are. And by the way, these are political issues. These are not military issues. The military gets its chance subsequent to determining what the question is and what the general approach is going to be, despite the fact that I came up through the military. This is a political, national leadership question, not only in the United States, but in these other countries. So I'm going to start first with South Korea. And these are going to be woefully short descriptions of these countries. I won't get it all right. You may argue with some of my conclusions, and there's much more to say than I'll have time to in this short period. South Korea is one of the most dynamic and aggressive societies in the world, but militarily, the South Koreans have self-isolated themselves, for obvious reasons, on the Korean Peninsula. So getting the South Koreans to take a more proactive role off the Korean Peninsula is going to be a hard slog. But that's what I'm talking about. These are the alliance implications of the question and the proposition that I've tried to lay out. Taiwan is a natural salient. Geographically, it plays a tremendously important role in this battle space. But Taiwan has been minimized, Taiwan has been undermined and demoralized since derecognition. And mainland China's suborning of Taiwan is clearly very, very successful. Whether or not the United States can turn that around, whether or not the United States can encourage and facilitate Taiwan's taking on a much more proactive role, not only in its own defense, but in lending its geographic position to this battle space, to dominating this battle space, remains to be seen. Obviously, very, very difficult. But whoever controls Taiwan is going to control that salient, because that salient can point inward or outward. And finally, Japan. I managed the U.S.-Japan alliance for 5 years. Some of the most fascinating, difficult, exhausting, and frustrating time you can imagine. Since long before I came on the scene, and I started my management responsibilities in the spring of 1991, the United States has been asking Japan to do more. And Japan typically, pretty much across the board, although there have been some changes along the way, has resisted those requests. Certainly resisted response in any overt, if I can say it this way, satisfying way. Although Japan was a bulwark during the Cold War, although on its own terms. Now, however, at the end of 2010, Japan changed its national strategy because of the militarized emergence of China. And this is sort of one of those questions, this is one of those junctures in history where we may actually get something that we've been asking for a long time from Tokyo. Because of the election that occurred about 24 hours ago in Tokyo, maybe 36 hours ago now, with the renaissance of the Liberal Democratic Party, with the move to the right of Japanese politics, it may be that Japan is a much more overt participant in Northeast Asian security. Northeast Asian security as opposed to Japanese security. There's a big difference for Japan. This is all yet to be seen how this will play out. In each of these cases, what's particularly interesting for the United States, and this lies at the feet of Beijing, in my view, is that any of these changes that I have described in Seoul, in Taipei, or in Tokyo will cause themselves great reverberations, political and security, throughout East Asia. And East Asia, at the end of all of this, no matter how it works out, whether we're eminently successful with our alliances or not, is going to be a very different place, either because China wins, China drives us out or drives us away or reduces our effective profile, or because we have been able to, the way we did with NATO Europe, put together a grand coalition. The latter effort is going to cause a political rise of these three countries, if there's anything to that, if we can do it, if they want to do it, and if we're successful in doing so. So these are some of the things that have to be thought through. From these initial what's the strategy answers comes then all of the military technical, military operational, doctrinal, and, if I can say it, cultural changes that would have to accrue both in the United States and in East Asian security. So this is, and Brian has heard me say this before, and maybe some of you have, this is the most important thing that I have ever confronted. My service during the Cold War notwithstanding, because this is more difficult than the Cold War. This is not a binary competition where it's very simplistic and all you have to do is build up, where force levels have such salience. This is a competition in which thinking and strategic derivation and strategic planning are going to be the first and the most important element in our relationship with our allies and with China. I hope there'll be some questions, and I think we'll wait until the very end for the questions, because that's when it gets really interesting, instead of listening to me drone on. So with that, I think I'll quit, and I hope I've given you something to think about.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And now, Brian Macrath.
Good morning. Glad you're here. Holiday season. Those of you who celebrate Hanukkah had a warm.
I hope you had a warm festival of light over the last 8 days that ended last night. I did not get the bow tie memo. Had I gotten it, I would have been befuddled. I own 4 of them. I know how to tie none of them. Paul tells me all the time, it's just like tying a shoe. I am wearing slip-on shoes. Thank you for having me here today, Chris. I'm a conservative politically, and so when you get invited to come to Hudson, it's like baseball fantasy camp, surrounded by some of the greatest thinkers. I'm here today because my personal favorite naval thinker, Seth Cropsey, is getting some surgery, and he's a steadfast member of the team here at Hudson, so I appreciate his having me pinch hit. It's good to be with Paul, a man from whom I learn a great deal about Asian security issues, and I also want to recognize my colleague Tim Walton in the back of the room, who teaches me more about China every day, and I'm not sure there's a 25-year-old American who knows more about China than he does. I'm going to start today by making some assumptions, about the Asia-Pacific security environment in the near term so that you get a sense of what I ground some of my perceptions on. First, China will continue to rise in comprehensive national power, notwithstanding reports about the prospects for significant slowdowns in their economic growth. Additionally, their military capabilities will continue to improve, and with these improvements will come an increased willingness to use force in more assertive and coercive ways. China will not experience major democratic reform. I know there's hope among some that the recent leadership change there is a harbinger of good things to come. I don't think that's the case. China is an amazing dichotomy. In some ways it's becoming more open, in other ways it's becoming more authoritarian and repressive. Next, China will not seek to provide security as a public good in this region. The U.S. will continue to play the role as the security guarantor of the Asia-Pacific. We will not withdraw, and we will seek to improve security cooperation with allies and partners. I say this because there is a very honorable school of thought, mostly coming out of my friends at Cato down the road, who say we ought to just pack up and leave. These are rich countries. They can do this on their own, and I reject that. If you want to ask me about that in questions, I'll be sure to pile on there. And the current Asian arms race will not dissipate in the foreseeable future. Changing correlations of forces among the nations of the region, the U.S., its allies, its partners, and China, and the irresolution of some of these seemingly intractable territorial claims will produce an increasingly unstable environment. Well, it's a set of assumptions. They're in our rearview mirror, and now you can get a better sense of where I come from when I say some of these other things. I want to let you know I prepared 1,600 words of talking. I'm going to call an audible about halfway through because Jerry Roncolato's not here and we have a little bit more time. I'm going to insert a little air-sea battle talk in there because that seems to be very popular and maybe it'll spur some conversation. The Asia-Pacific has grown in wealth in the past 3 decades, but during that time, the security concerns are evolving. Keeping in mind that there are numerous insurgencies to various degrees in the region, the security concerns of the nations of the region increasingly are turning less from internal security, dealing with insurgencies and the like, and more towards external matters. I think there's 4 reasons for this. The first, the region has become more democratic, and regime survival, such as it is, isn't something that is fought for in political terms internally. The threats internally have dissipated. Second, economic growth has increased resources available to fund larger defense establishments, especially more externally capable systems like aircraft and warships. Third, the combination of increased capabilities in historical mistrust and nationalism aggravates the desire of nations to protect their territorial sovereignty. Put another way, more and more countries have the means to protect their territorial claims, and they are now bumping up against each other with increased regularity. I think the fourth trend here to talk about is obviously the rise of China, specifically its military capabilities and its assertiveness. I think a decent example of this to talk about at a forum like this is the July 2010 ASEAN Ministers Conference in Hanoi, in which the Chinese foreign minister responded to remarks by Secretary Clinton about freedom of navigation by calling them an attack on China. At the same conference, the same minister told the Singaporean Minister for Foreign Affairs, channeling Herodotus in some amazing way, that China is a big country and other countries are small countries. After this incident, some thought that a return to the Chinese charm offensive would occur, but it hasn't. This trend of Chinese assertiveness at times aggressiveness is going to continue to grow, and these territorial disputes will become more likely because China is growing and becoming more powerful. Other nations are growing and becoming more powerful. It seems almost axiomatic. So the U.S. and its allies and partners in the region fit in the larger picture of the naval strategy, which is, I think, the primary component of this discussion today, in two ways. The first is the promotion of bilateral access, and the second is the use of multilateral cooperation and coordination. Asia-Pacific partners and allies grant America access. This bilateral access is sometimes referred to as the hub-and-spoke approach. Since the end of World War II, and some would argue for perhaps decades and even centuries before that, the U.S. has had three primary interests in the region. One, economic access. Two, preventing the rise of a regional hegemon who could cut that access off. And third, promotion of democratic values. For 2 centuries, the U.S. has wrestled with just how far forward it should be in the Asia-Pacific as a maritime power to effectively engage and to protect its interests. In fact, some have advocated during our history for an even larger presence. For example, after the end of the Spanish-American War, the Navy Board in the United States, looking at obviously keeping Subic Bay in the American orbit, urged the government to establish an American toehold on the Asian continent, something akin to an American Hong Kong. The president and Congress at the time thought better of that and did not pursue it. The second approach, next to bilateral access, is this concept of multilateral cooperation, and the East Asian region is loaded with multilateral cooperation. ASEAN, ASEAN +3, the East Asian Summit, the APEC, Shangri-La Dialogue. There are all kinds of gatherings of defense ministers and the like that provide valuable opportunities for discussions of economy, security, and transnational issues of importance. Some scholars even see more Chinese participation in these fora as essential to deterring them from a more revisionist behavior. Perhaps. But my assessment is that the ASEAN way, non-interference, consultation, consensus, and non-confrontation, has had limited success in setting regional policy, coordinating member states, and attenuating serious security concerns, especially the maritime security concerns. Put another way, multilateral efforts have not replaced the role of the United States as the guarantor of Asian security, nor are they likely to. So what is to be done? Now I call the audible. I'll start with a discussion of United States policy and practice. Air-sea battle has gotten a bespeckled reputation in the American news media and throughout the world, largely fueled by cadres of people who have never read it. It is a classified document, various levels of classification. I have worked on some levels of air-sea battle and have access to none of a good deal of air-sea battle. Air-sea battle, at its heart, is a prescription for the United States Air Force and the United States Navy to operate more effectively together in the face of anti-access and area denial threats. This is not a beer hall putsch by 2 of the 4 armed services to render the others irrelevant. If you talk with Air Sea Battle Office people, which I do regularly, you cannot help but come away from discussions with them impressed by the degree to which their deliberations are centered on doing what we do now better. Tactics, techniques, procedures. Looking at the way these two services operate and making those services operate better together. Because no matter how important our land forces are, they have to get there and they have to be protected when they're there. These are jobs of the Navy and the Air Force. And the cooperation that these two services are showing together is something that I think ought to be applauded. I won't dispute that I wish it had all been kept secret and that nobody said anything, because all it did was send everybody off into their corners to come up with their own interpretations. Allies have questioned what it is that is going on. The United States government was all too slow to approach those allies and to explain exactly what's going on and what we believe could be the contributory roles of these allies. I believe that process is underway now, and that the Department of Defense and the Department of State are working through the region to ensure a broader understanding of air-sea battle, if nothing more than to ensure that our friends and allies understand the thinking behind it. I want to be totally honest here. Air-sea battle, at least as I understand it, is at least as strong a deterrence idea as it is a warfighting idea. It occurs to me that making the East Sea Fleet commander wake up every morning and decide that today is not the day is a good thing. And that the world's largest military making a potential regional peer competitor think deeply about what it does and what it wishes to do is a good thing. There are some in this town, the estimable Colonel Dr. T.X. Hammis over at NDU, who would say that this is just a giant waste of money, that we will never, ever attain useful military parity in this approach, that we should basically, and this is my view, and you can come at me if you want during the questions and answers. I've debated this with him before, that basically back up past the first island chain, cede the interior lines of the South China Sea to the Chinese, and concentrate on an economically devastating distant blockade plan. And that we should do this with the full knowledge of the Chinese. We should let them know and everyone else know that this is our strategy and that we have ceded air-sea battle. We will not let the Chinese people and government fear for their own militarily useful mainland targets. We'll just write that off. We're not going, and in T.X. Hammis and some of these others, they say it's too dangerous. It's going to bring on a nuclear war. All I can tell you is we are more likely, in my view, to bring on conflict with China if we back away than if we remain there and strong. All right, that's the audible. What can our Asian friends do? Jim Thomas at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments has a great context he refers to as Asian Hedgehogs. And practically this means the development of ground-based anti-ship systems, survivable air defense systems, and dynamic and capable ground and to some extent amphibious forces. The creation of A2AD keep-out zones of their own. You look around, you can see that Japan, Taiwan, South Korea clearly are capable of this. They're very prosperous nations who spend a reasonable amount on defense. But as you start to walk through the South China Sea, the money available to implement this hedgehog strategy becomes more difficult. And as I talk about later, that's where we come in, where we can help develop some of this. But it seems to me that the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and others have some interest, or should have some interest, in the creation of their own A2AD keep out zones as a way of denying the ability to compel. This hedgehogs approach sets up a little bit of a sword and shield approach, right? This is our East Asian neighbors in the pursuit of East Asian security can build up their own their own shields, their own defensive measures, their own airspace, their own territorial waters, and leave the United States free to use its strategic mobility, to wield its sword to strike enemy force generation nodes, and to advance along multiple lines of advance. Linked together, this suggests a division of labor. This approach is maximized for combat effectiveness, okay? Because I believe that that is what leads to credible deterrence in peacetime. Ultimately, I think that should be our aim in Asia, our strategic aim, and that is to protect and assure our friends and allies that we are there and we are there with them, elbow to elbow, and to ensure that Chinese decision makers are aware that we are there and we have lots of friends, and that, as I said earlier, it's not a good day to start a fight with us or any of our friends. In order to bring this about, I think there are just a couple of actions, and I'll blow through these pretty quickly. First, we need better information sharing arrangements and agreements, especially at the high end, among the United States, South Korea, and Japan, especially. I'm unaware of the political obstacles to bringing Taiwan into such an arrangement, but I have to imagine they're considerable. But we make very, very halting steps towards the creation of information environments in which battle-relevant information can be passed quickly among these nations. The progress is too slow, and we have to increase it. Second, I think the U.S. must continue to build upon the work done thus far by the Obama administration in the Asia-Pacific. Now, I take a back seat only to Seth Cropsey in my criticism of this administration's foreign policy. But this is an area of the world where I think they're getting it generally right. The LCS, the rotational LCS employment, littoral combat ships in Singapore is a good thing. The negotiated the negotiations with Australia that have led to what will eventually be about 2,500 rotationally placed U.S. Marines training with Australian forces. It seems as though each week brings news of a thawing or a more warm relationship with the Philippines. We need to extend that. Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. At the same time, we have to really privilege India, Australia, and Japan. You can see sort of, to some extent, creating this triangle, because those three nations are critical to East Asian security. We have to treat them separately. We have to treat them with respect. The relationships have to be managed out of a sense of mutuality that sometimes we don't do very well. And finally, I think as I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of area here in the South China Sea, the nations rimming the South China Sea, for the development of this Asian hedgehog approach. I have one of my clients is the Army Air Defense Artillery, and I've been writing and thinking quite a bit recently about the contribution of the United States Army in the Pacific. And while I think an additional maneuver battalion in every BCT sounds like a good idea to the Army, I think more air defense in the Pacific makes a lot more sense, and that air defense as a vanguard of Army engagement in the region makes the most sense. I'm going to draw this to a close by stating that I cannot know with certainty that an activist, forward-deployed American presence in East Asia will deter China. But I am relatively confident that if we were to shrink from our responsibilities, our historic responsibilities, forces would be unleashed over which we have little control. China would become a regional hegemon. China would return to the role it has played in the region for centuries, minus a short 130-year pause. It is a historic role, and we have to keep that in mind. Question for me is whether this status would occur at the end of conflict, or whether it would occur at as a result of the nations of the region cutting good deals with the new sheriff in town. Either way, not good for the United States, and we would wind up on the outside looking in. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Brian, and Paul as well. So now it is question time, and I'm going to exercise a moderator's prerogative and ask a quick question of our two discussants before turning it open to any of you who may have your own questions. My first question has to do with tools. As I have been working on such issues relatively recently, but only relatively recently, I'm struck by the degree to which Chinese conceptions of CNP, comprehensive national power, are characterized by a very great degree of conceptual breadth by comparison to how the Soviets seem to have approached such things. Very great interest in issues entirely unquantifiable, which is ironic for a system that aims to sort of rank order everyone, but emphasis upon psychology, politics, what Chinese Communist Party propagandists have called discourse control, both in the international arena as well as at home. And these kinds of sort of squishy political, sort of psycho-political dynamics as a component of national power. And I'm wondering, I don't have Ural's Navy credentials. I was a reserve intelligence officer, but I like talking the Navy military stuff as much as anybody, but I also worked at the State Department for a while doing diplomacy, and I'm interested in what you all might think we should be thinking in terms of that public discourse side of things. How do we ourselves approach the sort of politico-psychological aspects of competitive strategies with respect to these issues in the Western Pacific? That's question one. Question two has to do with some of the work that some of my colleagues here at Hudson have been doing in recent years on the ramifications forward of debates that China faced during the Qing dynasty in the last dynasty of China, the imperial dynasty in the 19th century, with regard to facing a choice as it was conceived at the time between whether to focus principally upon Western or continental threats versus Eastern maritime threats. And I actually had a very interesting experience in Beijing doing some work a few months ago, and hearing some PLA officers actually discussing amongst themselves whether or not the great Qing dilemma between dealing with internal frontier issues and external maritime frontier issues, what its relevance was to the present day. And clearly China has been developing its western provinces and its interest in overseas lines of energy resources, its diplomatic and political relationships with countries to its west, developing its western interior economically. To what extent does that Qing dilemma bear upon how it is that the rest of the Asian Pacific region might approach competitive strategy thinking with regard to these very salient maritime dynamics that we face today? Whoever wants to take either one of those, please jump in.
Okay, let me take the first. Tim, raise your hand back there. Tim has written a paper for me on the three warfares, the concept of the Chinese three warfares, and I think what Chris aptly refers to falls very neatly into the concept of three warfares. I look at the Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet Union had a propaganda strategy, centrally managed, and it had some victories, right? But it was a sideshow, and it was amateur hour compared to what we see from China in its practice of three warfares. It's Tim, legal, media, and psychological. All right. This isn't Annex, Charlie of the war plan, buried deep in the back. This is front and center of how China thinks about military power. It's sophisticated. It is, again, it is central. And you get to see it every day. Every day. I'm amazed at the number of Chinese fishing trawlers that have video cameras on them, so that they can, so that footage can be relayed almost immediately back and out to a waiting world to see how these rapacious other people keeping them from fishing in historical Chinese waters. This doesn't happen by accident. This is generated. These are concepts of operation. Most of what we do in the United States in this regard, we're uncomfortable with, right? Some of it's what we call psychological warfare, and that kind of goes off into really black ops kind of stuff, and can't talk about it here. Some of it talks about, it reeks of manipulation of the press, which again, we can't do. What we can do here in the United States is understand three warfares, to read it. I mean, it's not like they're hiding it from us. They publish on this stuff, and then guys like Tim Walton write about it. The playbook is there. We just need to know more about it. We need to make, I think it would be reasonable for the defense establishment to begin to dialogue with our own media in a way that says, here, this is what we found. You do with this what you want. You can determine whether you are being manipulated, or you can continue in business as usual. Your choice, but we're going to show you what they say they're going to do. So this is a sort of a bold new frontier in this competition with China in three warfares, and it's something that I think all of us ought to know a little bit more about. And I can talk to the second question only if Paul passes on it.
Thanks, Brian. The issue of this political dialogue that's underway between China and the rest of the world is based upon the perception of two things. One, that conflict is the natural order of things. And so this is a conflictual discourse. The second is that China is winning because China is succeeding. And nothing succeeds like success. And so based upon these 2 points, China is, as Brian has said, with the three warfares and in other ways, is trying to supplant, disrupt, replace American mores, and more to the point, Western and liberal mores and approaches to governance, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but globally. So it seems to me that the fundamental issue is whether or not we are going to succeed. And what that really means is that this is not first and foremost a military problem. This is first and foremost a governance and economic issue. Whether or not the American approach can be held up as a positive alternative. This is one of the reasons why Taiwan is fundamentally so important here, because Taiwan is a Chinese society that has adopted these kinds of approaches. So if conflict is a normal course of events and it's a constant, and your system rises or falls based upon, in the eyes of others as well as at home, based upon perceptions of success, we better get our act together here domestically, because that's what's going to determine how much we can do and how successful we will be. with regard, my answer to the second point that Chris raised is very short and succinct. China has chosen. China has secured its continental borders for all intents and purposes, and is pushing outward to sea.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think I just read 2 weeks ago a book by the travel writer Paul Theroux. We talked about taking a train ride through China and visiting the western provinces. This is 1985, and this is something I don't know much about, and I was struck by the degree to which the people he talked to in the region considered themselves to be separate and different. I think those of us who study this and who look at this, who think that these interior issues are something that make our job easier, I think we're kidding ourselves. I think I think China has enough manpower to do what it needs to do to keep these provinces pliable. And obviously, if I wanted to go up to Langley and sit around and think about how would I mess with China, I would certainly look at these places as ripe for some fun. But in general, I just don't think that it's as big an issue as some people make it out to be or want it to be.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to ask our panelists a question? I see one hand. The first hand up is right here on the aisle, and I think Perry will have that mic for you right now.
Paul and Brian, thank you very much. Vance Morrison, a former naval person myself. I notice on the chart there are dashed lines that perhaps were formed by reading earlier PLA Navy iterations of their naval strategy. Is there a current iteration in which they have said what they intend to do?
Definitive? I think I've read enough authoritative documents to lead me to believe that the following. Number one, they are not seeking to be a globally dominant Navy. They wish to become more dominant in their own region. Outside of that, I don't have a good handle on whether there is an extant Chinese maritime strategy. I read 2 years ago that there was one being developed, but I haven't heard it being released yet.
It's nice to see you again, Captain. The body of dialogues and pronouncements coming from China make it clear that in the context of at least initial forays to sea, that China is going to try to dominate what's inside that first dotted line closest to the mainland, which is the first island chain, and that in order to do so, China has to probably at least control, or at least deny, the blue dotted line that runs through Guam, which is the second island chain. The reason I derived this approach, this mental map that I have, which became a physical map, was because I happened to be thinking about this one day while I had a book open about World War II history, which is my avocation and sometimes my vocation. And I happened to glance down at a depiction of the greater Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere. And it struck me, it resonated so strongly that I've said what I said today, and I've shown you what I'm showing you. Because it's the same problem. It's the problem of an Asian country trying to keep out Western maritime powers. And so this is, first of all, it's instructive because this is how somebody tried to do it before, namely Japan. Second, this is all about geography. And you have to look at the map at least occasionally. And Americans are notorious for not doing so. And it strikes me that the Chinese are doing so, and that the Chinese are carving out subspheres in this area, but more broadly have said that in this area, this is where we're going to be kept out. And that's what their anti-access area denial pronouncements add up to. So to answer your question specifically, it seems to me that it's that sum of those pronouncements that we have to take as their maritime strategy.
Great. Let's see. The second hand, I believe, was the second person in right across from our previous questioner.
Yeah, Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. I have two questions. One is you can read the military documents and planning documents of the Chinese as you can in the U.S., and you'll see all kinds of different scenarios. That doesn't necessarily result in policy. The policy decisions are usually taken along a broader front. So the assumption that China is going to move in such and such a direction because they are definitely very assertive today is kind of a foregone. Doing that is a conclusion that really might not have a basis. I think there's more of a discussion within the Chinese leadership about what they're going to do in the next 10 to 20 years. They probably don't even know what they're going to do in that time, but they're trying to deal with some substantial problems and taking it really one day or 1 year at a time. We must understand their culture, of course, where they're coming from. We can look at the Qing dynasty, but I must say history doesn't repeat itself, even though, as Mark Twain said, it does rhyme. So there is a certain basis there, but that doesn't mean that history is going to go in that direction. And it seems to me that by basing a policy on the notion that this is what they're going to do may have unintended consequences. It's like when Truman told Joe Stalin at Potsdam, "We've got this bomb," and Stalin turned to Molotov and said, "You better get Kurchatov to work much more quickly," was kind of an unintended consequence that may not have happened. That's my first question. Aren't we going a little too far on that? Secondly, with regard to the allies, aside from Japan and the Philippines, who tend to be very much anti-China and sometimes use the U.S. backing in a very provocative way, the other allies may have a different attitude toward that. South Korea in particular has a very strong relationship with China economically, politically. They have a closer relationship. Singapore, Indonesia, and these other countries also probably view the situation a little differently than the U.S. And I know there have been instances where, as I think Brian mentioned himself, the U.S. has been a little bit too in your face, and they've reacted, and we had to back off. And I was wondering what you'd say about the difficulties of this alliance building in terms of the approach the U.S. is taking.
Could you clarify one of the very last things you said? Who was in whose face? You said, is it U.S. is in whose face? Too much?
That the U.S. was too much. The other countries had objected a little bit that the U.S. was too much in your face with regard to China as far as they were concerned. They did not want such an aggressive, they didn't want to be a part of an aggressive U.S. posture vis-a-vis China.
With regard to where China is headed, you can wait to decide if you'd like. It seems to me that there's either a bad explanation for what's happening, I don't mean incorrect, but I mean consequentially bad, or a very bad explanation for what's happening. The bad explanation is that the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese military are like as lips and teeth with regard to their pronouncements and actions. That's the bad circumstance. The very bad circumstance is that they're not, and that there's a split in Chinese governance. But I think it's incontrovertible that Chinese statements, political statements and military statements, and Chinese political actions and military actions are aligned, whether there's an internal agreement or not. And that the evidence of where China is going and what China is doing is quite clear. I think this is not least in part because China believes that telling us what they're doing is a very, very effective way to approach this. So it doesn't seem to me worthwhile to wait to decide. Now, the problem is, of course, that we are waiting. Or, excuse me, the reality is that we are waiting. Because there is, for all the right reasons, there is great reluctance to reach these conclusions. Why? Because the outcomes are going to be horrible. They're going to be really bad, which is why I believe in a deterrent policy, which means, by the way, that you have to be ready to fight before anything bad happens. Otherwise, you're going to lose all along. So I don't think that this is a question of having to wait for the bad news. I think we've got it. And of course there are going to be consequences, and the consequences are really pretty bad. Now, if we can succeed in maintaining American presence and American control of the situation in the Western Pacific, then the consequences will be less bad, but it's going to be terrible. It's going to be hard. It's going to be, at least it's going to be expensive. That's the first thing. As far as allied views go, I know most about Japan. But let's start with Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, it seems to me that there is more than a nascent response to Chinese, and I'll use the term advisedly, aggression. Certainly Chinese bad behavior. And with the exception of Cambodia as the chair of the ASEAN forum that just wrapped up last month, Southeast Asian countries are very, very concerned. So as a result, you see Singapore allowing us to home port 4 ships in Singapore. Now, let me use Japan, however, as a more to-the-point example. Japan has changed its entire military strategy based upon its concerns over the militarized emergence of China. Now, that's not the only reason that we should do something, although China is a treaty ally, and we are, excuse me, Japan, thank you. Japan is a treaty ally, and we are committed to her defense. However, it's a pretty good indication of the thinking that's going on really throughout Asia. Japan and these other nations that you talk about are frontline states, and they know it. In some cases, culture prevents them from saying or doing too much. In some cases, not. What's so intriguing about the Japanese example is that after so long, so many years, decades and decades of American entreaties that Japan do more, Japan is on the cusp of doing more. So this will be very interesting. So I think this is not just in my mind, but I think in Asian capitals, this is a foregone conclusion now. Now the question is what to do about it.
Mr. Jones, I would respond to your first statement by saying that unintended consequences are something that we have to think about. Although I would suggest to you that, as I did in my words, that foreseeable consequences of a policy in which we are less engaged lead you to the similar outcome. And so when I think about the foreseeable implications of being there and being strong and being engaged, I like those odds. I like those odds more than the unintended consequences. Secondly, all nations are different. Our diplomacy has to be deft. Has to be built around a concept of mutuality. There is obviously public diplomacy and private diplomacy. And again, line up the teams, right? I think up until very recently, China had North Korea and Burma, and I think we're picking Burma off their side. I like our team, and so we just have to. The diplomacy has to be done deftly, and we have to understand what their motivations are, and we push them as much as we can push, and we let off if we push too much.
I think the next questioner was immediately to the left of our previous questioner, right there on the aisle, if you could, Perry. Thank you. And then we're going to go in the back.
Thank you. I'm Mike Fonte. I work as the Washington liaison for the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what you see President Ma's positioning of Taiwan as the salient that you talked about. There's some question. Obviously, the party I work for is an opposition party. They have some questions about the way he has positioned Taiwan vis-a-vis the Senkaku Diaoyutais and also the South China Sea. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Who wants to bite?
I'll bite, at least initially. The relationship of the United States and Taiwan is very important to this region. My personal view is that Taiwan and mainland China continue to move closer and closer to rapprochement every day. I believe that Taiwan has come to see democracy, as is practiced there, as important to its culture. And this rapprochement will not happen until it views China as more democratic. It won't happen peacefully until it sees China as more democratic than it is today. President Ma appears to me to recognize the very difficult position he and Taiwan are in vis-a-vis the United States and China. And he appears to me, while he may be of the other party, I certainly don't wish to be offensive, he appears to be taking a solid middle road, middle path to ensuring. And there are enough people in Taiwan who eventually see unification with China as a reasonable thing that they can't be discounted. But they don't want this reunification to take place on terms that are not satisfactory to them. And I think President Ma recognized that, and he is doing a pretty good job. I think there are others in Taiwan who would push harder and faster and who would create situations that would add to instability in the region.
I think mainstream thinking, both in Taipei and Washington, is that it's worth preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. That's China's line. Let's get along so that we can preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. The Taiwan Straits are neither peaceful nor stable. China has thousands of missiles aligned across the straits against Taiwan. That is not a peaceful act. The military balance continues to shift in Beijing's favor. That is not my definition of stability. So, if Taiwan wants to be in charge of its own destiny, then the leaders in Taiwan and here in Washington are going to have to consider whether those are acceptable circumstances or not. So far, obviously, that hasn't happened. Until that happens, my notion of bringing Taiwan online as a salient is simply not going to work. Taiwan is geographically a salient, but at this moment is neither militarily nor politically a salient.
Gray sweater.
Blue gray sweater, yes.
Thank you. I have basically two questions, but one almost answered by Paul about Taiwan potential to be back to the strategy. How potentially Taiwan would go, because the culture, the relation with the mainland, and particularly their political leaders seemed like hesitation and indecision in the past. Is not very able leadership in Taiwan. This is my question. And the second question is about more fundamentally about this thinking about China. Seems like we're assuming the conflict, the hegemony struggle in this area with the United States. Assuming this is the picture. But I feel basically Chinese are kind of like people quite different from their culture, the people's behavior pattern, from the samples we have to compare in this like question of strategy. Mainly, most recently is Russia, right? The Cold War just ended historically not too long ago, and also Japan's World War II experience with the United States and China is so strong, aggressive. Also, although Japan geographically is close to China, in Asia, but the culture, the military history, everything, people's personality is quite different from China. And also, like we quoted about the Western history, which I personally am very interested in Western history, American founding father, everything. I feel Chinese are kind of passive people, passive. It's not very aggressive, very passive in their culture. Is different. I'm afraid if we consider like in terms of Russian, Japan, could be not very right and could be fulfilling to some kind of a conflict in the future, which is something I'm worried about the United States judgment in this perspective. Thank you. I'll appreciate your comment from anyone from a panel.
Thank you. Let me point out that we are at 11:30. What I would like to do is take 2 additional questions, and I saw a hand here in front of me and then one in the back on the left there. And I'm afraid that'll have to be it. But I'd like to get all those questions on the floor, and then we'll allow our panelists to respond to them and then to sort of sum up as they would like to do thereafter. So why don't we start, let me see, start up here in the very front, in front of the pillar, if you could, please. Yes, I would like the panelists to answer take all of these. I'll put them all on the floor and give them a chance to sort of cogitate before offering a final dump of wisdom, which we will all take home with us with smiling faces. So.
All right. Bill Houston. My concern is that the U.S. is weak in this area, and that's why there's the Chinese filling that void. For instance, I think that the Taiwanese are looking at reunification with China, not because it's in their economic or political interest, as you may have said, that they're looking for a democratic way to do it. But I think they see the writing on the wall is if China does make an aggressive action against Taiwan, we will not go in there and fight for the Taiwanese. And I think they see that. They saw that when our P3 was brought down, even under a conservative government, we didn't go in there and take that P3 back. So there is that void over there. The other missing piece that I see in this is throughout our World War II history and beyond, we've had a very key ally in the NATO, and that's Great Britain. They seem to have a better backbone because they've been working in the international arena for much longer. And they understand that their best interest is what should be driving them and not what other countries may think of them. And America, unfortunately, a lot of times we worry about what the world thinks of us instead of what's in our best interest. And we develop our strategy based upon, well, gosh, we don't want to tick off Indonesia, or gosh, we don't want to tick off our Chinese neighbors. So there's that point that we worry too much about what the world public opinion is, and that drives our strategy, and I think we need to change that.
I would also encourage our questioners to be concise.
Those would be my 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then finally, for our last accumulated question, back there on the my left, the far right of the from the rear.
Tony Liao, Central News Agency, Taiwan. A question about Diaoyu, Senkaku Island. We have seen China deploy regular mission in the area from the ocean and the air. If China do become dominant forces over there, what's the risk to Japan, Taiwan, and U.S.? And what's the implication to first chain and second chain island strategy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
could you, did you get a good handle on that last question? Could you?
The final question on
Yeah.
implications of
If Chinese becomes dominant?
of a military dominance in the region if I'm not mischaracterizing you, sir, implications of in the event that China does in fact obtain the kind of local military dominance that it is seeking. Risks and implications to Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and implications for the island chain.
Okay. I'll start, sir, with at least part of your question. You talked about sort of the cultural demeanor of the Chinese people as passive. I'm not sure that's borne out historically, and I think if you ask some of their neighbors over the centuries, they might argue with that. I think that's, yeah, I'll keep it at that. I think they are capable of as capable of conflict as any other human beings. Sir, you believe that this question in Taiwan is to some extent a function of U.S. weakness. Perhaps. I don't totally disagree. I think China's growth and strength plays into this also. I think we had pretty, you used the P3 issue. I think we had some pretty limited options in that EP3 downing in 2001. Going in and getting it, it was a diplomatic issue that was solved ultimately diplomatically. I think we suffered as a result of it, but I'm not sure we had a whole lot more, a lot of good cards to hold on that one. Could be a function of our weakness. Maybe this is a circular argument. I think we are, the administration's turning its eye of Sauron over here, and it's looking at the region, and the Navy talks a lot about building up, and we'll build all the way from 285 to 300 ships over the next 30 years or whatever the thing is, and we'll get 9 more ships here in the next 10 years, none of which will be a DDG or an SSN or an amphibious vessel. They're going to be other ships with other utility. For my view of things to proceed apace here, I think the Navy will have to grow in the region, and it will have to get different. We lost Captain Jerry Hendricks, who was here. He has an idea of fast patrol vessels, scores of them, that would either be maintained by a sea base or with allies who wish to have their own versions of such ships operating in composite squadrons. There's a lot more the Navy can do, and so I do believe we are increasingly, at least relatively, weaker. Whether it's our own choices, which, people talk about economy right now, what we spend on defense remains a choice in this republic. Both the way we spend what the department is given, and what the department is given. Those are choices, political choices. We are far from the bottom of the barrel, and we could spend more on Asia-Pacific relevant capabilities if we wanted to, if we made that strategic choice. We haven't yet. We've moved the rudder over a tiny bit. And finally, the implications, I think, broadly put, the implications for are that China would become the dominant power in the region. China would act as a more coercive power in the foreign and perhaps even the domestic policies of the nations around it. I don't believe China is currently in the business of the provision of the public good of regional security. I don't see that in its writing about what it believes its armed forces and its destiny is. I think it's quite happy with regional security around the world provided by the United States, and the United States not in such a big position in its own backyard.
If Paul would take a swing at responding to any of the questions that he would like to address, and then I'll give you guys just each a couple of minutes just to sort of leave us with some tidbits to send us out the door smarter and wiser people.
The first of the three questions had to do with China being passive. Hardly. In fact, the true test of character is what you do when you have sort of choices. And China has chosen, as China's national strength has increased, to be anything but passive. This is the fundamental nature of the militarization of China's emergence. China has chosen to militarize its emergence. It didn't have to. It wasn't being held hostage by the United States or Tibet or South Korea. It just simply wasn't the case. China has chosen to be anything but passive. Second question had to do with U.S. weakness and best interests. I don't think there's any question, Bill, that the United States right now is trying to fill a void created by its own departure from Southeast Asia. This has caused great consternation and concern and confusion, not least in Beijing. Not least in Beijing. So this is a lesson that when history turns, when history pivots, like at the end of the Cold War, don't lose your composure. Don't withdraw. The recent CSIS presentation and study on American force structure doesn't concentrate on this, but illustrates this withdrawal. They have a good graphic that shows this retrenchment on the part of the United States to very few and far more distant American bases. This was a mistake. We're trying to overcome it. As far as best interests, I agree with Brian that we had few alternatives when the EP-3 was forced down. It wasn't forced down. It had to make an emergency landing because it was badly damaged. But I don't think we had no alternatives. And I was a Navy pilot. The reason I wear bow ties today is because when I was going to school in Tokyo, I was in my first couple of weeks of school and I was gradually working my way through my wardrobe, and I happened to bring a bow tie with me. It wasn't the only tie I wore. I didn't wear it first. But when I wore it, my Japanese classmates responded like this, that I said, okay, I know what to do. I got to wear it tomorrow. And I haven't worn a long tie since, except in service dress blues or at funerals. I think we should have done the same thing when that EP-3 was forced down. And I don't mean to say that our surveillance programs have come to a halt, but we should have made a point right then. We're going to keep doing this, and then we should have publicized it. We should have shouted to the heavens that this is an inalienable international right to conduct surveillance like this. And because of the ensuing confusion of not asserting that right, although we can still conduct surveillance, the Chinese were really confused and thought they were onto something. And so we've sort of, you know what the results of that are. The third question had to do with if China dominates in the East China Sea, what are the implications for Taiwan and Japan and so on, and for the United States? The reason the situation in the East China Sea is so important right now, this is an issue for today, not next week, not next year, not next decade, today, is because if China is permitted to assert its claims and to continue to conduct its bad behavior in the East China Sea, just as in the South China Sea, then the game is over. This is why this is so dangerous right now, because the potential for escalation is so dramatically high, because all the cards are on the table. This is what China is trying to achieve, is dominance in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and throughout the first island chain, and control, or at least denial, of the second island chain. And so that's what that would mean.
Final words. Brian, would you like to lead off?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to. I was a consumer here today too, so I took away two things that I need to go think about. The first thing that I want to think about more is how does a unified Korea play into this situation? America has quite a bit of military power and influence in Korea right now, I think largely focused at North Korea. But that situation is going to solve itself sometime, whether by explosion or implosion, but it's going to happen. At that point, unified Korea has a nice long border with China, and my sense is that Korea could become less of a U.S. ally at that point, a significantly different situation than there is today. So that's something I want to think about. The second thing I want to talk about is a phrase you use. You talk about China's choice. And I'm trying to think about another rising power that has chosen to do anything different than what China's doing. I find myself hard-pressed to think about a nation on the way up, economically, politically, and diplomatically, who doesn't also build its military and then those things. So I don't want to don't want to let them off the hook or any of that. But what I do is I think that this is natural and foreseeable. Getting back to unintended consequences, the rise of China and the way it's rising shouldn't be a surprise. We should be able to think, yeah, this is natural behavior for rising power. I don't know that there have been that many instances where a rising power has been well managed. I think the last good turnover was Britain to the United States, I guess, right? But there were a lot of things that led to that don't exist here. But I just don't think it's as easy as to say that they're making a choice. And if they're making a choice, they're making a choice, the same choice everyone else makes. So I wonder whether it really is a choice.
Thanks. Paul?
Well, this has been very useful for me because, as Brian has said, I take away a lot from these questions, and having the prospect of having to speak publicly then makes me think harder about what I think and so on. It seldom causes me to reconsider my wording sometimes, but that nevertheless. At the beginning of Brian's remarks, he alluded to debates that he's had with T.X. Hammes, for instance, between the air-sea battle approach, which is essentially to hold at risk targets in China, versus a distant blockade. I think my approach is somewhat in between those, which is essentially a close blockade, which is to hold at risk. Now, I understand that war fighting has to be integrated and there's more to it than the Navy. I got that part. I am not a naval chauvinist, although my experience is in the Navy, and I think that's relevant here. So my perspective and my choice, to use that word, is to hold the PLA Navy at risk. Because to the extent that the PLA Navy is at risk, the U.S. Navy isn't. And to the extent that the U.S. Navy isn't, we can assert our presence and our combat capability and our deterrence posture. And this comes back to deterrence. This comes back to choices. This comes back to changing opinions. Where? In Manila, in Seoul, in Pyongyang, in Taiwan, in Japan, and in Beijing. In particular, in Beijing. So an offensive U.S. Navy is a natural U.S. Navy. This is Navy doctrine. But because of the letdown after the Cold War, the U.S. Navy is going to have to rethink this business of offensive mindedness, of bloody mindedness. And it's going to have to rethink the notion of geography, because it's been a very long time since the U.S. Navy has had to think about geography. You don't think about geography in the sense I'm talking about when you're on Yankee Station. You don't. You simply think about getting over the beach, conducting your mission, and getting back to the ship. That's not strategic. That's operational. So raising the level of intellectual effort and strategic thinking, and considering putting the PLA Navy and maritime interests at risk. Now, speaking of which, can I have the next slide, please? Can you do that real quick?
And
I just want to close on this. I want to close on this because my sense is that this is not, and this may take a minute, and hopefully we'll get to it here in just a second. So this is not just about a close blockade, though, because if you think about China's strategic vulnerabilities, on the one hand, as Brian said, there's more to it than the maritime approaches, and I, of course, completely agree with that. However, China's maritime interests, whether or not China's military interests are global, China's maritime interests are. And there are ways to advantage, leverage, and defeat China far from the maritime salient. And you can see these lines of communication going to East Africa and into the Gulf of Aden and into the Gulf of, in the Straits of Hormuz, because that's where China has to go to get the raw materials that China needs. Now, that may change over time as the availability of shale, gas, and oil increases, not least in China. We'll see. But for the moment, this is a dramatic strategic liability on the part of China. Also, for the moment, it's a strategic advantage that the U.S. Navy is not prepared to address.
Thank you very much. On that note, we should wrap up. I want to thank all of our audience for coming, and those of you who have joined us on live streaming on the internet, please thank you as well. But most of all, I would urge our audience to please join me in thanking our excellent participants here today for coming here and helping us learn these things better. Thank you all for coming, and that's it.